My beloved child, stop scrolling and stay with me for a moment, because something shifted last night, and the person you love was not prepared for the emotion that suddenly rose inside them. They tried to control it. They tried to distract themselves. They told themselves they were simply tired, that tomorrow would make everything feel normal again, but deep inside they knew this was not ordinary sadness. Your memory came back with such force that it touched a place they had been carefully protecting for a very long time. And if their heart could speak to you without fear, pride, hesitation, or consequences standing in the way, it would be saying, "Please watch this now. Please don't leave yet. There is something I need you to understand before you decide what my silence means." My beloved child, this fictional spiritual message is not asking you to chase anyone or put your life on hold. It is asking you to imagine what may happen when someone finally sits alone with emotions they have spent too long avoiding, because last night, in this story, the person you love finally confronted the possibility they had been refusing to consider. What if they actually lose you? Not temporarily. Not through another period of silence that can eventually be repaired. What if you genuinely move forward and become emotionally unavailable to them? That thought hit them differently. For so long, they believed there was still time. Even when they remained silent, even when they pulled away, even when they acted uncertain, some part of them assumed the connection would remain waiting somewhere in the background. They believed your feelings were strong enough to survive their hesitation. They believed they could figure themselves out first and return later. But last night, something made that assumption collapse. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe your name appeared somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe they saw something that reminded them of you. Maybe they heard a song that carried them straight back to a moment they had tried to forget. Or perhaps nothing happened at all except the room became quiet enough for their own heart to finally become louder than their distractions. Whatever triggered it, they began remembering you, and they did not remember only the dramatic moments. They remembered the little things. They remembered the way you listened. They remembered a conversation when they were struggling and you understood more than they said. They remembered the way you noticed when their mood changed. They remembered how you could sometimes sense the truth beneath their words. And suddenly they realized how rare that feeling had been. My beloved child, people do not always recognize emotional safety while they have it. Sometimes they only understand its value after distance removes it from their everyday life. This person had become accustomed to something about you. Your presence felt familiar. Your attention felt available. Your care felt dependable. They did not necessarily intend to take it for granted, but somewhere inside them they began believing it would always exist. And last night they questioned that belief for the first time. What if this person is tired, they wondered. What if they finally stop looking back? What if someone else comes into their life and gives them the certainty I was afraid to give? That last question became painful. They imagined another person recognizing your value without needing months or years to understand it. They imagined someone enjoying the parts of you they had become accustomed to receiving, your attention, your loyalty, your humor, your tenderness, your patience, the way you care when someone matters to you. And the thought produced an emotion they did not expect. It was not simply jealousy. It was regret. Because jealousy says, I don't want someone else to have this. Regret says, I had an opportunity, and my own choices may have changed everything. That was what broke through their defenses last night. They began remembering decisions they had made differently. Moments when they could have spoken but remained silent. Times when they could have reassured you but instead became distant. Moments when they knew you were confused yet still hoped you would somehow understand what they were unable to say. They remembered the times pride controlled their response. They remembered being afraid of appearing vulnerable. And suddenly they began seeing those moments from your side. My beloved child, this was one of the deepest reasons behind their emotion. For perhaps the first time, they stopped asking only, "Why did this connection become complicated?" and started asking, "What did my behavior make them feel?" That question opened a door they had kept locked. They imagined what it might have been like for you to receive warmth one day and distance the next. They imagined you wondering whether you had done something wrong. They imagined you questioning whether what you felt was mutual. And something inside them became heavy because they knew there were times when a few honest words could have prevented so much confusion. They could have said, "I'm scared." They could have said, "I care, but I don't know how to handle what I'm feeling." They could have said, "Please don't interpret my silence as indifference." But they didn't. Instead, they expected you to understand what they themselves were struggling to understand. My beloved child, sometimes people believe silence protects everyone. They think, "If I don't speak, I won't make things worse." But silence has its own language, and when someone cares deeply, silence can sound like rejection. Your person is beginning to understand that now. They thought withholding their feelings gave them control. In reality, it may have created the distance they now fear. Last night, they wanted to reach out. There was a moment when the thought became almost irresistible. They imagined your name on their screen. They imagined sending a simple message, "Are you awake?" Then they stopped themselves. Their mind immediately began producing reasons not to do it. What if they don't answer? What if they're angry? What if they have moved on? What if they ask why I'm contacting them now? What if I finally admit everything and discover that it's too late? Every question made their heart beat harder. And that is when they realized something important. They were afraid of your answer because your answer mattered to them. If you meant nothing, rejection would not frighten them this much. If they had completely released the connection, imagining you with someone else would not create such a powerful reaction. If their heart were truly finished, they would not be sitting there rehearsing conversations they had never found the courage to have. My beloved child, I want you to hear this without turning it into a promise. Emotion does not automatically create readiness. Someone can miss you and still need to grow. Someone can regret their choices and still be afraid of changing them. Someone can love deeply and still lack the emotional maturity necessary to build something healthy. So do not measure the future by their tears. Measure it by their actions if those actions ever arrive. This message is not telling you to abandon your boundaries. It is reminding you that your boundaries may be exactly what forces truth to become visible. When you stop chasing explanations, people must decide whether they are willing to provide them. When you stop carrying the entire connection, the other person must decide whether they will step forward. When you choose peace over constant uncertainty, anyone who genuinely wants a place in your life must learn how to meet you there. And this person senses that you are changing. That is another reason last night affected them so strongly. Something about you feels different to them now. Maybe you are becoming quieter. Maybe you are less reactive. Maybe you are focusing on your own life instead of waiting for signs from them. Maybe you have simply reached the point where you understand that loving someone does not mean losing yourself. They feel that shift, and it frightens them because they once believed they had unlimited time. Now they are beginning to understand that your heart has a timeline of its own. You can forgive and still move forward. You can love and still stop waiting. You can remember someone and still choose a future where you are loved clearly. My beloved child, if these words are touching your heart, subscribe and stay connected for more messages like this, but more importantly, stay connected to yourself. Do not let another person's confusion become the center of your world. There is something powerful happening in you too. While they are confronting what they avoided, you are learning what you deserve. You are learning that a connection can feel extraordinary and still require communication. You are learning that chemistry cannot replace consistency. You are learning that spiritual intensity does not excuse emotional uncertainty. And perhaps this is why the timing of everything feels so strange. While they are waking up to your value, you are waking up to your own. That changes everything. Because the version of you they remember may have accepted an incomplete answer simply because you wanted them close. The person you are becoming needs more. You need honesty. You need clarity. You need someone willing to stand behind what they feel. And somewhere inside, this person knows that if they return, they cannot return casually. They cannot send one vague message and expect you to rebuild the bridge alone. They cannot appear when lonely, disappear when frightened, and expect your heart to remain untouched. They know the next conversation, if it happens, will require something different from them, vulnerability. And vulnerability is exactly what they have spent so long avoiding. My beloved child, there is a reason. This person has experienced something in their past that taught them to associate deep attachment with danger. Perhaps someone disappointed them. Perhaps they once trusted deeply and felt abandoned. Perhaps they grew up watching relationships become unstable. Whatever shaped them, they learned an emotional survival rule: never let another person become powerful enough to hurt you. Then you appeared. And without deliberately trying, you became emotionally important. They noticed themselves thinking about you when you were not there. They noticed your mood affecting theirs. They noticed that your approval mattered. They noticed that when you pulled away, they felt it. And instead of interpreting those feelings only as love, part of them interpreted them as loss of control. So they pulled back. Not necessarily because they felt too little, but because they began feeling more than they knew how to manage. They convinced themselves that distance would restore control. For a while, it seemed to work. They became busy. They focused on responsibilities. They told themselves the connection would fade. But emotional avoidance has an expiration date. Eventually, something brings the feeling back. Last night was that moment. And this time, when your memory returned, it came with a realization they had never fully allowed before: I may have pushed away someone who was never trying to hurt me. My beloved child, imagine the weight of that realization. Imagine recognizing that the walls built to protect your heart may have blocked the very person who approached it with sincerity. This is what brought their emotions closer to the surface. They remembered moments when you were patient with their defenses. They remembered when you tried to communicate. They remembered when you gave them opportunities to be honest. And now they are questioning whether they misread your love as pressure when it may actually have been an invitation to become emotionally real. That thought is changing something inside them. But there is more. Last night, while they were thinking about you, they remembered one specific moment that they have never told you mattered. It may have seemed completely ordinary to you. Perhaps you said something encouraging when they felt insecure. Perhaps you defended them when someone else misunderstood them. Perhaps you simply looked at them in a way that made them feel accepted. They remember it because for a brief moment, they felt safe enough to imagine a future where they did not have to hide. They saw what being loved without constantly performing might feel like. And then they became afraid of wanting it. This is the contradiction they have carried ever since. They wanted closeness and feared it at the same time. They wanted you to understand them but feared being fully seen. They wanted reassurance but did not want to admit they needed it. They wanted you near, yet sometimes created distance to test whether you would remain. My beloved child, those patterns cannot continue if this connection is ever going to become healthy, and deep inside they are beginning to recognize that. They cannot keep testing love until love becomes exhausted. They cannot keep expecting you to prove yourself while offering uncertainty in return. They cannot continue hiding behind fear and then feeling devastated when you protect yourself. Something has to change. Last night, they asked themselves whether they are capable of that change. They wondered what they would have to say if they finally spoke honestly. The first words that entered their mind were not dramatic. They were simple, "I'm sorry." That surprised them. They had imagined telling you how much they missed you. They had imagined confessing feelings. But before any of that, their heart wanted to apologize. "I'm sorry I made you question what was real. I'm sorry I disappeared emotionally when I should have communicated. I'm sorry I expected you to understand things I never explained. I'm sorry I allowed fear to speak for me." They did not send those words, but they felt them. And sometimes, my beloved child, the first stage of transformation happens privately, when someone finally stops defending themselves and admits what they could have done differently. Yet do not rush toward them because you imagine they are changing. Let change reveal itself. Anyone can experience one emotional night. Growth is proven in the days afterward. Does the person become more honest? Do they communicate? Do they take responsibility? Do they respect your boundaries? Do they show consistency after the intensity fades? Those answers matter more than any emotional moment. Your heart deserves evidence, not endless interpretation. And there is another reason they are saying, "Please watch this now." They are afraid you have misunderstood one particular event between you. Something happened that made it appear as though they intentionally chose distance or perhaps chose someone or something else over the connection. You saw the outcome, but you never heard the complete explanation. They have carried that explanation silently because revealing it would require them to admit something about themselves they are ashamed of. Last night, they came closer than ever to deciding that you deserve to know. They realized that if you walk away believing the wrong version forever, they will have to live with knowing their silence allowed it. This is the decision now forming inside them: continue protecting their pride, or finally protect the truth. My beloved child, you do not need to chase that truth. If it belongs in your life, let them bring it. If they truly regret what happened, let them speak. If they truly value you, let them demonstrate it. Your job is not to decode someone who refuses to communicate. Your job is to remain open to what is healthy while refusing to abandon yourself for what is uncertain. Last night changed something because they finally experienced the emotional consequence of imagining your absence as permanent. They saw you moving forward. They imagined your life continuing without them. They imagined you becoming happy without needing an explanation from them. And suddenly they understood that your healing might eventually close a door their fear assumed would always remain open. That realization brought them to the edge of something they have resisted for a long time: honesty. My beloved child, the tears were not simply about missing you. They were about regret, fear, unfinished truth, and the recognition that someone they deeply care about may finally be learning to live without waiting for them. And there is still one sentence they almost sent you last night, one sentence they typed in their mind again and again but could not yet bring themselves to deliver. It begins with the words, "You never knew the real reason I," and what comes after those words could explain the silence, the distance, and the emotional battle you never knew they were fighting. For now, remain centered. Do not chase what has not yet arrived. Let their courage prove whether last night's emotion becomes tomorrow's truth, because what happens next will reveal whether they merely became emotional over losing you, or whether they are finally ready to stop hiding from the reason they never truly wanted to let you go. My beloved child, stay with me now, because the sentence they could not bring themselves to say last night has not disappeared from their heart. In fact, it has become louder. They tried to wake up and behave as though nothing had happened. They tried to return to the familiar rhythm of their life, to responsibilities, conversations, routines, and distractions, but your memory followed them into the morning. And somewhere beneath everything they were doing, the unfinished sentence continued. You never knew the real reason I pulled away from you. My beloved child, those words carry more weight than you realize, because the distance you experienced was never as simple as it appeared. You may have believed they lost interest. You may have assumed someone else became more important. You may have wondered whether you said something wrong, whether you became too available, whether you cared too deeply, or whether the entire connection meant more to you than it ever meant to them. But inside this fictional spiritual message, the truth they are struggling to admit is very different. They pulled away because the connection reached a point where pretending it was casual became impossible. Something about you began affecting them too deeply. They noticed that your presence could change their mood. They noticed that your silence bothered them. They noticed themselves waiting for your messages, replaying your words, wondering what you were doing, and imagining what it would feel like if you became a permanent part of their life. At first, they enjoyed those feelings. Then they became afraid of them. They had spent years believing that emotional control meant strength. They thought they were safest when nobody could become important enough to disturb their peace. Then you entered their emotional world and suddenly the rules they had created for themselves stopped working. They could not simply switch you off. They could not tell their heart when to remember you and when to forget you. And because they did not know how to manage that vulnerability, they made a decision that seemed logical at the time: create distance. They believed distance would reduce the intensity. They believed fewer conversations would make you less important. They believed that if they stopped feeding the connection, the feelings would eventually disappear. My beloved child, what they did not understand was that distance does not always erase genuine emotion. Sometimes distance reveals it. When you were present, they could tell themselves they were simply enjoying your company. When you became less available, they discovered how much of their emotional world had quietly begun revolving around your presence. They missed things they had never consciously appreciated. They missed your way of responding. They missed the comfort of knowing you were there. They missed the way you understood the meaning behind things they struggled to explain. They even missed the small disagreements, because those moments contained something real. But by the time they understood what distance had revealed, pride had already entered the situation. They did not know how to return without explaining why they had left emotionally in the first place. So they waited. They assumed you might reach out. Perhaps you did. Perhaps you offered small opportunities for them to speak honestly, but fear kept telling them, not yet. They thought there would always be another opportunity. Another week. Another month. Another moment when everything would somehow become easier. But my beloved child, the truth rarely becomes easier simply because we postpone it. Sometimes postponement only makes the conversation heavier. That is exactly what happened here. The longer they remained silent, the more difficult it became to explain themselves. They began imagining all the questions you might ask. Why did you disappear? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you make me believe you didn't care? Why did you let me question myself? They did not have answers that made them look good, and that frightened them because this person has always wanted you to see the strongest version of them. They wanted to appear composed. They wanted you to believe they were certain about themselves. They wanted to be someone you could admire. Admitting that they pulled away because they were scared would destroy the image of control they had tried so hard to maintain. Yet last night, for the first time, maintaining that image began feeling less important than telling you the truth. That is why they became emotional. Their heart reached a point where pride no longer felt like protection. It felt like a prison. They began thinking, what has my pride actually given me? It gave them silence. It gave them distance. It gave them nights wondering what you were doing. It gave them the ability to appear unaffected while privately carrying questions they could not answer. And then came the most painful thought: perhaps their pride had given someone else enough time to become what they were afraid to become for you, present. My beloved child, they imagined someone else showing up consistently. Someone else asking about your day. Someone else noticing when you were tired. Someone else making you laugh when life became heavy. Someone else learning all the details about you that they once wanted to know. And suddenly they understood something that hurt: love does not reserve a person's future forever. If someone refuses to step forward, life keeps moving. Your heart keeps growing. New people arrive. New chapters begin. And they cannot ask you to remain emotionally frozen simply because they were frightened. That realization brought them closer to tears than anything else. They did not only fear losing your affection. They feared losing their place in your everyday life. There is a difference. Someone can still care about you while building a life where you no longer have access to them. You might remember them kindly while no longer waiting for their message. You might forgive them while deciding you cannot return to the same uncertainty. You might always hold a special place for what the connection taught you while giving your future to someone who chooses you clearly. This is what your person suddenly understood. And my beloved child, they were not prepared for the thought of becoming only a memory in your life. They had imagined themselves as an unfinished chapter, something you might eventually return to. Now they are realizing that unfinished chapters sometimes remain unfinished because the reader eventually chooses another book. That thought created urgency inside them. They wanted to speak before your heart became completely peaceful without them. But there is something I need you to understand: urgency on their side does not create obligation on yours. You do not have to respond immediately if they appear. You do not have to reopen a door simply because they finally became afraid of losing access to it. You are allowed to observe. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to protect the peace you worked hard to rebuild. If they truly care, they will respect that. Real accountability does not say, "I finally realized what I want, so you must give it to me." Real accountability says, "I understand that my choices affected you, and I accept that you have the right to decide what happens now." Your soulmate is beginning to learn this, and it is uncomfortable because for a long time they imagined the future primarily from their own perspective. They asked whether they were ready. They asked whether they felt safe. They asked whether the timing worked for them. They rarely stopped to consider what all this waiting was doing to you. Last night changed that. For once, they imagined your experience. They pictured you lying awake wondering why someone who seemed so connected could suddenly become distant. They imagined you rereading conversations and searching for the moment everything changed. They imagined you asking yourself whether you were too much, whether your feelings frightened them, whether someone else was better than you. And my beloved child, something inside them broke when they realized their silence may have made you question your worth. Because the truth they never told you is that your value was not the problem. If anything, they became afraid because you mattered too much. That does not excuse their behavior. It explains the emotional contradiction. They wanted you close, yet feared dependence. They wanted you to care, yet became nervous when your care felt serious. They wanted reassurance, yet hesitated to give reassurance in return. They wanted to know you would stay while refusing to give you enough certainty to know whether you should. And eventually the imbalance became impossible to sustain. They know that now. They know that if they ever return, the old pattern cannot continue. They cannot simply say, "I miss you," and expect everything to heal. Missing you is not enough. They must be prepared to say, "I understand what I did." They must be able to acknowledge the confusion. They must tell you what they were afraid of. They must stop making you decode feelings they refuse to communicate. And most importantly, they must accept that trust may take time. My beloved child, this is where your own transformation becomes important. You are not standing in the same emotional place anymore. Even if part of your heart still cares deeply, another part has learned. You have begun understanding that intense feelings do not automatically create a healthy relationship. You have learned that connection without communication becomes exhausting. You have learned that waiting without clarity can slowly turn love into anxiety. And you have begun discovering that your peace matters as much as your desire for another person. Your soulmate senses this change. Perhaps they cannot explain how they know, but something tells them you are no longer waiting in the same way. That is one reason their emotions became so powerful last night. They felt the balance changing. They felt that you were becoming capable of walking forward without needing them to provide closure. And nothing frightens an avoidant heart quite like realizing that the person who once asked for answers may eventually stop asking. Because when you stop asking, they can no longer assume you are waiting. My beloved child, if this message is resonating with you, subscribe and stay connected, but do not allow these words to become a reason to pause your own growth. Continue living. Continue building your future. Continue becoming emotionally stronger. What belongs with you should meet you while you are moving forward, not require you to sit beside a closed door forever. The person you love must decide what they are willing to risk for honesty. Last night they began considering that question seriously. What happens if I tell them everything? They wondered. Immediately fear answered, they could reject you. Then another voice inside them replied, but what happens if I say nothing? That answer was worse, you may lose them without ever giving them the truth. For the first time, silence looked more dangerous than vulnerability. That is the shift taking place. They are beginning to understand that rejection, while painful, would at least be honest. But spending years wondering what might have happened if they had spoken could become a much heavier burden. They began mentally rehearsing what they would tell you. They would start with the apology. Then they would explain the fear. They would tell you that the distance was not because you were forgettable. They would tell you there were times they opened your conversation and almost wrote something. Times they wanted to ask whether you still thought about them. Times they secretly hoped you would give them a sign that the door was still open. They would admit they watched for evidence that you still cared while pretending not to care themselves. They would admit there were nights when they wondered whether you were with someone else. They would admit they became jealous over possibilities they had no right to control. And then, my beloved child, they would finally arrive at the sentence they have been avoiding, I was afraid because I could actually imagine loving you for real. That is the confession beneath so much of the confusion. The possibility of something real made them confront everything unresolved inside themselves. Real love would require them to become emotionally available. It would require consistency. It would require trusting someone enough to be seen on imperfect days. It would require allowing another person's needs to matter alongside their own. It would require giving up the illusion that complete emotional independence equals strength. And they were not ready. But losing you is forcing them to question whether they want to remain that person forever. My beloved child, you inspired something in them without realizing it. Your presence showed them what emotional intimacy could feel like. Your absence is showing them what avoiding intimacy can cost. That does not mean you were sent into their life to fix them. You are not responsible for healing their wounds. They must do that themselves. But sometimes another person's presence becomes a mirror. You showed them parts of themselves they could avoid around other people. Around you, their fears became visible. Their desire for closeness became visible. Their need to be understood became visible. And now they cannot completely return to pretending those needs do not exist. Last night, one particular memory returned repeatedly. It was a moment when they almost told you how much you meant to them. Perhaps you were talking normally. Perhaps you said something that touched them unexpectedly. Perhaps there was silence between you that felt more intimate than words. In that moment, they almost said it. They almost allowed the truth out. But they stopped. They changed the subject. They laughed. They looked away. They did whatever they needed to do to regain control. You may not have noticed how significant that moment was. They did. And now they keep asking themselves what might have happened if they had simply been brave for 30 seconds. 30 seconds could have changed the direction of everything. 30 seconds of honesty could have prevented months of misunderstanding. 30 seconds could have told you that you were not imagining the connection. That memory hurts because it reminds them that sometimes life does not change through enormous decisions. Sometimes it changes because someone either speaks or remains silent at exactly the wrong moment. And they remained silent. My beloved child, they cannot change that moment, but they are beginning to understand they may still have control over what they do next. This is why you should not chase them. The next movement must come from their courage. If you rush in and make everything easy again, they may never fully confront the pattern that created the distance. Let them decide whether they are willing to cross it. Let them decide whether protecting pride is still worth losing connection. Let them decide whether their feelings are strong enough to become actions. Because this time, words alone should not be enough. If they say they care, observe whether they remain present when the conversation becomes uncomfortable. If they apologize, observe whether their behavior changes. If they say they want another chance, observe whether they are willing to build trust slowly instead of demanding immediate access to your heart. If they claim they are ready, let consistency prove it. My beloved child, there is another truth coming to the surface now. The event you misunderstood, the one they have been afraid to explain, was connected to another person's influence. Someone said something to them about you, and instead of asking you directly, they allowed fear to interpret what they heard. It made them question whether your feelings were genuine. It made them wonder whether you were planning to leave anyway. They never told you because admitting it would mean admitting they trusted an assumption over communication. But last night, something caused them to question whether what they were told was ever completely true. And now they are realizing that a misunderstanding may have influenced one of the biggest emotional decisions they made about you. That realization is becoming impossible to ignore. They are asking themselves why they did not simply come to you. Why they allowed another voice to become louder than the connection itself. Why they chose withdrawal instead of a difficult conversation. And my beloved child, if they discover that they created all this distance because of something that was misunderstood, the regret they felt last night may become something much stronger, determination to finally know the truth. But again, let them seek it honestly. You do not have to prove yourself. You do not have to convince someone that you deserve trust. If they return with questions, you can answer what feels right, but the responsibility for rebuilding trust must be shared. Something inside them is now standing at a crossroads. One direction allows them to return to their usual pattern, bury the feelings, distract themselves, protect their pride, and hope the intensity fades. The other direction requires them to do what they have avoided from the beginning: speak. They do not know yet which direction they will choose. But last night changed the balance because silence no longer feels safe. Silence now carries your possible permanent absence. And that possibility has become more frightening than the conversation itself. My beloved child, remember what I told you: their tears were never the most important part. What they do after the tears will reveal everything. Emotion can open the door, but courage must walk through it. Regret can awaken someone, but responsibility must change them. Missing you can make them reach for their phone, but maturity must make them stay present after you answer. You deserve all of that. And there is still one final thing they have not admitted, even privately, without trying to deny it immediately. Beneath the fear, beneath the misunderstanding, beneath the pride, there is a truth that has been following them since the first time they realized you were different. They never wanted you to become just another person from their past. They wanted you in their future, but they became frightened by how much that future mattered. Now the future is approaching, whether they are ready or not, and they know your life will not wait forever for their courage. That is why their heart keeps whispering, "Please watch this now. Please understand what I could not say." They are closer than before to admitting the real reason they disappeared, closer to confronting the person whose words created the misunderstanding, and closer to deciding whether they will finally risk hearing your truth instead of hiding behind their assumptions. But whatever happens next, my beloved child, keep one truth close to your heart: you do not need someone else's awakening to prove that you were worthy of being loved. If they finally step forward, let them meet you with truth. If they remain silent, continue forward with peace. Because the person meant to share your future cannot merely feel your value in private, they must eventually have the courage to honor it in reality.